Yes.
So, Michael, before the break, I'd been asking you about the current problems bulletins. Do you have any recollection as to whether there was ever a current problems bulletin about factor concentrates for haemophilia and risks of hepatitis or AIDS?
Not that I'm aware of, but I need to look at the current problems. You probably got the whole lot.
Can I ask you then about Dear Doctor letters? If we look at an example of a Dear Doctor letter from your time as chair, first of all, it's at MHRA 0034836_101. So this is a letter from you. I don't think it's dated, but there's a handwritten date which looks like it might be 1993 in the top right-hand corner. And we can see it's an example of a Dear Doctor/pharmacist letter, high lipase pancreatins, reports of colonic strictures. The Committee on Safety of Medicines has recently received 7 reports of fibrotic strictures of the large bowel occurring in children aged between 3 and 13 years with cystic fibrosis. All the patients have been taking capsule preparations of pancreatin containing high levels of lipase and other enzymes for several months. A similar case has been reported in Denmark. And then if we skip to the next paragraph, in the UK there are about 4,000 patients with cystic fibrosis receiving pancreatic replacement capsules with high enzyme levels. There are 4 relevant products available, and then those are listed. If we go down the page, just below the table, the letter continues, at least one case is known to have occurred with each of these products. At present, no cases have been reported in association with other preparations of pancreatin or in patients who do not have cystic fibrosis. 5 cases were reported from a single centre, and the true frequency is uncertain. Investigations are being carried out to elucidate the underlying mechanism and appropriate measures for prevention. Now, just pausing there before we look at the next paragraph, it would appear that this was a product used for, a product in respect of which there had been only a handful of reported cases, and the full extent of the problem was not known. Is that right?
I think so, yes. I don't recall this, Dear Doctor letter, but anyway, go on.
The fact that things were uncertain and that there'd only been a handful of cases clearly didn't prevent the Committee on the Safety of Medicines from issuing a Dear Doctor letter.
Sorry, it didn't what? Sorry,
didn't prevent you from issuing a Dear Doctor letter.
No.
You didn't have to have a critical mass of cases, in other words.
No, and it was really a sort of to find out if they had been underreported.
And then if we just read the next paragraph, it says the above products are useful for patients needing large quantities of pancreatin. However, the benefits now need to be considered in the context of the possible risk of colonic strictures requiring major surgery. The committee therefore recommends that all patients taking, and then you list the particular products, should be reviewed. Unless there are compelling reasons, patients with cystic fibrosis should be advised to change to other pancreatin preparations for the time being. As strictures have developed many months following the start of high lipase products, all patients who have received them should be monitored carefully. If symptoms suggestive of gastrointestinal obstruction occur, the possibility of bowel stricture should be considered. It's important that any suspected cases are reported to us. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. Now, that longer paragraph that I've just read, Sir Michael, it suggests that the Dear Doctor letters didn't simply provide information about possible adverse consequences. The CSM actually gave advice and recommendations to doctors about what they should do, reviewing every patient taking the product, and changing to different products unless there were compelling reasons not to.
Yes.
And was that fairly common, that the CSM would issue clinical advice, clinical recommendations about what doctors should do?
Yes, it was, I think, yes.
Do you know if any Dear Doctor letters were ever issued in relation to factor concentrates in the 70s or 80s and risks of hepatitis or AIDS?
Not that I'm aware of, but my memory may have failed me.
I absolutely understand, Sir Michael, that you may not recall that. But can you think of any particular reason or any good reason why, if this is the case, no current problems bulletin or no Dear Doctor letters were issued in relation to the risks of factor concentrates?
No, I don't. I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Can I ask you to look at then another document? It's at RLIT 0001623. Now, this is a newspaper report from this year about a different product, sodium valproate. And just so you understand, Sir Michael, I'm not asking you about sodium valproate at all. It's been the subject of a separate inquiry. I'm just using this as a basis for a more general question, and I'll show you how that arises. If we could go to page, I think it's page 5, please. Yes, so this article describes how the Committee on the Safety of Medicines considered sodium valproate in the early 70s, before your time. If we just look at the bottom 2 paragraphs on this page, I just want to read what's said here and over the page, and then ask you about the CSM's approach more generally. So what's reported here is that the committee concluded that the use of anti-seizure drugs such as sodium valproate was indeed liable to produce abnormalities, but they stated that the risk appears to be low and not sufficient to justify stopping the use of the drug. In a decision that would have disastrous consequences for thousands of families, the committee chose not to alert the public to the concerns that the drug could harm, top of the next page, babies, concluding that since the evidence was not clear, doing so would risk causing fruitless anxiety to patients. They specified that warnings should be provided to doctors, but not on package inserts, so that there would be no danger of patients themselves seeing it. And then there's an observation in the next paragraph. The committee's decision not to warn women of the risks was probably influenced by the paternalistic nature of society at the time. Now, as I say, I'm not asking you about sodium valproate at all, Sir Michael. It's a series of decisions taken before you joined the CSM. My question is a more general one. During your time on the CSM from 1979 onwards throughout the 1980s, was there a culture of wanting to avoid causing anxiety to patients, or a paternalistic approach to the provision of information to patients?
Well, yeah, I think not under my chairmanship, but when I was chair, but previous chair, I do remember once saying we mustn't alarm the public about something. I can't remember what it was all about now. But that struck me at the time as being a bit unusual or unnecessary. But I can't remember what the subject was. We shouldn't alarm the public or something.
Can we then turn to the question of adverse reaction reporting? So
yes.
If we go back to the document we've already looked at a couple of times now, MHRA 0004773. And just remind ourselves on page 1 what the document is. So it's the July 1977 leaflet on the control of medicines in the United Kingdom. And if we could go to page 16, please, Paul. Paragraphs 47 and 48, under the heading Adverse Reaction Reporting, record this. A central theme in the British approach to the regulation of the marketing of medicinal products is a conviction that controls before marketing are not sufficient. However extensive the precautionary animal work, some effects may not be detectable until a large number of patients have received the drug. In some countries, clinical trials before marketing are very extensive, running to some thousands of patients. In the United Kingdom, these are felt to be less useful than clinical trials on a relatively limited number of carefully observed patients to establish the pharmacological actions and efficacy of the drug and identify any major safety problems that laboratory animal studies had not detected. And then this, at 48, great importance is attached to the monitoring of possible adverse reactions to medicinal products. Advice on this subject is provided by the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, who have a subcommittee on adverse reactions to assist them. The committee maintains a register of adverse reactions to which confidential reports about individual patients are made on a voluntary basis by members of the professions, usually on a specially designed yellow card, which is issued to all doctors and dentists. Other data derived from sources such as the pharmaceutical industry, the Registrar General or coroners are also added to the register. 80 part-time doctors are engaged to investigate reports of individual reactions at the request of the committee or its secretaries. Summaries of information stored in the register are provided routinely for those who report suspected reactions and are also available for certain classes of authorised person who may inquire about them. All persons who report suspected adverse reactions may be assured that no information is released which would identify a patient without written permission. This permission is occasionally sought in order to put research workers interested in specific problems in touch with each other. Now, does that describe the adverse reaction reporting scheme as you recall it?
It does pretty well, yes.
And can you tell us in your own words how this yellow card system operated?
Well, yes, all doctors were provided with these yellow cards to use, and it wasn't my idea, but a GP said to me that when they wanted to send in a yellow card, they couldn't find the damn thing. Couldn't they? Why not put it into the British National Formulary? So at the next meeting of the CSM, I suggested we ask the BNF whether they would include a yellow card in it. Various people said, oh, they won't want that and all this stuff. But when we asked the British National Formulary, they did. And it's a yellow card. It's yellow sheets of paper interweaved into the BNF, and it's still there.
And in the period with which we're primarily concerned, so late 70s through the 1980s, that's a sheet that would be a hard copy physical yellow piece of paper that would be completed by the doctor and then, or pharmacist it could be, and then submitted to the medicines division or one of its reporting centres. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Just to get a sense of numbers of adverse reaction reports, if we look at WITN 6406003, so this is again the annual report for 1990, and if we go this time to page 7, we have the heading at paragraph 6.3, reporting of suspected adverse reactions. And then we have a table of the number of reports received since 1980. And we can see from 1980 through to 1990, the numbers fluctuate, but it's in excess of 10,000. And the highest number for that decade is, I think, for 1989, when it's 19,246. What's your recollection of what would be done with a yellow card report? So it's been sent in by an individual GP. What would the medicines division then do?
They would put it on a punch card, or they'd get and the only computer that the Department of Health had was down at Reading, and most of the week it printed out gyro checks. But on Thursday afternoon there was a gap, and it was able to look at yellow cards. And so I mean, it was a cranky system, really, but at least there was a possibility. But actually, it turned out that a lot of the coding had been incorrect. And so when some sort of signal emerged, the first thing you had to do was to pull out the original yellow card and see whether the reaction that had been coded correctly.
And then would there be some form of analysis or investigation of what was being reported by the doctors within the medicines division?
To some extent, yes. And then we had this little group, Argos, the adverse reaction group of SEER, which we looked at. We were the staff of the medicines division gave us copies of the printouts, and we would look at them and decide whether or not there was a sufficient volume of reports to be worried. What we were looking for was a signal, and 3 reports constituted a signal. Don't ask me why it was 3. It could have been 6. It could have been 2. I mean, it was just an arbitrary number, to be honest. And I wouldn't claim any credit for it at all. But it wasn't until the late 1990s that Professor Stephen Evans developed a much better way of developing signals. Professor Evans actually is one of the expert advisors to the inquiry.
Yes. I'm going to ask you to look at an annual review of yellow cards from 1986, co-authored by you, just to get a sense of some of the reactions that might be reported. So it's MHRA 0020159. So we can see, if we look at the top part of the page, this is a report for the Subcommittee on the Safety, Efficacy and Adverse Reactions, annual review of yellow cards 1986, and we can see that you were one of the authors, Sir Michael. If we go over the page, we see under the heading Abstract, in 1986, the CSM received 15,527 yellow cards. This was the highest number received in 1 year since the scheme started in 1964, and then there's reference to the inclusion of the yellow cards in the British National Formulary. And then if we look at the last paragraph in that section, despite the improvement in the number of yellow cards received, it is apparent that suspected adverse drug reactions are still grossly underreported. The CSM therefore asks all doctors and dentists to ensure that problems with both new and established drugs are brought to the committee's notice in accordance with the reporting advice given in the British National Formulary. Now, there are a number of documents you've referred to in your statement, Sir Michael, which describe this problem of underreporting of adverse reactions. What was your understanding of why there was such underreporting?
Well, I mean, there were a number of reasons. One is they weren't recognised by the doctor as an adverse reaction. Another possibility was that the doctor thought it was already well enough known and needn't be reported. And sometimes, perhaps, I don't know, indolence on behalf of doctors.
Well, one of the phrases used in one of the documents you've exhibited talks about reporting fatigue. Do you recall that as a concept?
Well, yes, I mean, I think there were a small number who did lots of cards and then they got sort of fed up with it. Tired of reporting.
If we then look at the next page of this document, can we look at the bottom paragraph? It said the yellow card scheme during its 24 years provides a total of 165,373 reports. The computer record of the yellow card reports is constantly updated. And then this, reports of suspected adverse drug reactions sometimes reach the CSM with considerable delays. Do you know why there were sometimes considerable delays in these reports getting to the CSM?
Well, I think this refers to the days when the reports were processed on Thursday afternoons in Reading. And I think it refers to that. It was much, I can't remember when, but it was towards the end of the 1990s, I think, when the CSM had its own computerized systems. But I'm not entirely sure.
And then if we go to the next page, please. Under the heading Serious Reactions, what's said there is the committee asks doctors and dentists to report all serious suspected adverse drug reactions, irrespective of the age of the drug or the notoriety of the reaction. Now,
yep, that's right.
So would it be right to understand that if we take, for example, a patient experiencing jaundice, a doctor should not say, oh, well, we know that factor concentrates cause jaundice, so we're not going to report this as a serious adverse consequence because this particular factor concentrate's been on the market for a number of years and I'm sure the CSM know all about it.
No, we wanted to know, we wanted to continue knowing, in case there had been a change.
And if we go over to page 6, please. So the kind of reactions that were reported are listed in this document, and we can see under the heading hepatic reactions, there's a reference there to manifestations of hepatotoxicity, including hepatic failure, hepatic necrosis, hepatitis or jaundice were reported following the administration of many different products as the most important reaction in 302 patients. So you would expect any doctor seeing hepatitis or jaundice should have reported that to the CSM.
Yes.
And then if we go to page 9, just under the heading reactions to newer drugs, this goes back to the black triangles system. It says there, the committee asks doctors and dentists to report all suspected adverse reactions, whether mild or serious, with new products marked with an inverted black triangle in the British National Formulary, the datasheet compendium and MIMS. So is this right? In relation to the generality of products, it was serious reactions that were reported, but with new products, which were marked with the black triangle, all suspected adverse reactions, mild or serious, had to be reported.
That's correct.
And then if we could go to WITN 6406020. This is a 1986 article by you, Sir Michael, entitled Spontaneous Reporting of Adverse Drug Reactions, published in the Quarterly Journal of Medicine. And if we pick it up in the second paragraph, you say this: spontaneous reporting schemes do indeed have substantial limitations. Firstly, they rely on doctors reporting suspected and not necessarily proven adverse reactions. Few adverse reactions, however, are uniquely iatrogenic, and an efficient spontaneous reporting scheme depends on doctors' professional skill and judgment in associating their patients' diseases with the drugs they've taken. Such schemes are therefore inherently more likely to detect those adverse reactions which occur soon after the start of treatment and which produce syndromes commonly having a iatrogenic basis, and you give examples. Conversely, reactions which have a long latency or which are expressed as conditions only rarely having a recognised iatrogenic basis may remain unrecognised by this technique. So just pausing there, and paraphrasing, is this right in terms of the limitation you were identifying? The scheme depended upon doctors spotting a potential connection between the reaction and the drug that the patient had been given.
Yes.
And where there were reactions with a long latency, or which were not commonly recognised as having a iatrogenic basis, that might be a reason why reactions didn't get reported. Is that the point you're making?
That's the point, yes, yes.
You then, the second point, you say, secondly, in the United Kingdom, as elsewhere, only a small proportion of even serious adverse drug reactions are reported to the CSM. Underreporting not only results in a substantial loss of useful scientific data, but may also lead to serious bias, since reporting rates are conditioned both by manufacturers' promotional claims and by adverse publicity in the medical literature or the media. Thirdly, reporting rates tend to decline with time after a product has been marketed, and that's then developed. And then if we go over the page, over to page 3, it's the last paragraph on this page. You say this: between 1972 and 1980, only 16% of doctors, mostly general practitioners in the United Kingdom, reported any adverse drug reaction to the CSM. The very considerable contributions to drug safety made by spontaneous reporting systems is thus due solely to the efforts of a small proportion of the medical profession. Hospital physicians are especially likely to see patients with serious adverse reactions. If they were to ensure that all suspected serious reactions in patients under their care were reported to the CSM, there is little doubt that drug safety, especially the clinical characterization of individual syndromes and the identification of risk factors, would be considerably enhanced. Now, you identify there and elsewhere in the exhibits to your statement that GPs accounted for the majority of adverse reaction reports, and there was a particular problem with getting reports from hospital physicians. Was there ever any investigation by the CSM as to why that was the case? Why there was this underreporting by hospital-based doctors?
I don't recall it, no. I don't recall anything, no.
And do you have any recollection of any particular steps taken by the CSM to try and encourage more extensive reporting of adverse reactions?
Well, I think it was in the late 1990s, we agreed that pharmacists could report. It wasn't my idea, but it was somebody I worked with who was a pharmacist, and said, why can't pharmacists report? So when I went to the CSM and suggested it, they said, oh, no, don't do that. Pharmacists won't fill them in properly. And anyway, the GP might object. So we did a little study where we got pharmacists to report, and two things emerged. Firstly, that pharmacists report were actually much more exact and precise than reports by doctors. And secondly, when we asked the doctors, mainly GPs, of course, whether they minded a pharmacist having reported an adverse reaction or suspected adverse reaction on one of their patients, and they said not in the slightest. No, it saves us having to do it. So that was when it got rolled out to all pharmacists.
Now, just want to ask you now to look at a document exhibited to your statement, which is an affidavit from Professor Asher from 1989.
Yes.
So he was the
chairman of the CSM then.
He was the then chair of the CSM. It's WITN 6406024. We can see the date of it is January 1989. The context is this was a challenge, it would appear by way of judicial review, in relation to steps taken by the CSM regarding a particular product, a particular drug or series of drugs. And I'm not going to ask you anything about those specific drugs, Sir Michael, but Professor Asher deals with the yellow card reporting scheme in some detail, and I wanted to ask you about that. So if we pick it up at page 10, He sets out what the yellow card reporting form requests in paragraph 17 of his affidavit. I'm not going to read that aloud. And then bottom of the page, paragraph 18, he says the reporting forms are sent either directly to the committee's secretariat or via the 3 regional monitoring centres in Cardiff, Newcastle and Birmingham. Each doctor receives acknowledgement of the receipt of his reports and a photocopy of the report for his records. Just pausing there, and one of the questions I've been asked to ask you, do you know why there was no regional monitoring centre in Scotland?
No, the 3 centres were in Cardiff, Newcastle and Birmingham were because there was a particular interest in adverse reactions in Cardiff, Newcastle and Birmingham. Newcastle, I was there. Cardiff, one of my senior lecturers had become professor in Cardiff, and another had become a professor in Birmingham in clinical pharmacology. So we had this particular interest, and we set up these regional monitoring centres so that the yellow cards were sent in firstly to the regional monitoring centres, and then we passed them on to London.
And then if we go to the next page, there is then a description from Professor Asher as to what would happen with the yellow card report. So if we go to the top half of the page first of all, he says each report is then processed in the following way. I don't think I need to go through the details of the stamping and coding, but 19.2 says each original report in coded form is sent to a senior medical officer for scrutiny. The medical officer checks the accuracy of the information on the computer entry form, decides whether additional information should be requested from the reporting doctor, and makes an assessment of the association between the drug and the suspected reaction. And then the form is entered into the computer database. So it looks like there was an initial assessment by a medical officer, essentially as to whether more information should be obtained. Did you have any involvement in that initial process, Sir Michael?
No, the senior medical officers, or the SMOs they were known as, were part of the staff of the medicine division.
And then if we look at the bottom half of the page, it said in paragraph 20, the computerised information is used to provide signals of possible new adverse drug reactions or of an increase in frequency of known reactions. A number of analyses are available routinely. And then 20.1 refers to the printout being scrutinised by the medical staff of the adverse reaction section at 2 weekly meetings. And I think that's probably a reference to what you described as the Thursday afternoon printout of the yellow form reports. And then 20.2, a printout of adverse reactions received for drugs under intensive monitoring. So those would be the black triangle drugs, scrutinised monthly by the medical staff and an advisory subgroup of the CSM. And that would be the subgroup of which you were a member. Is that right, Sir Michael?
Yes.
And then if we go over the page, paragraph 22 says, contrary to the statement made in Professor Farmer's affidavit, we needn't worry about that, there is no predetermined number of yellow card reports which constitutes evidence of a possible drug hazard. This would clearly be entirely inappropriate. Adverse reactions reported for drugs are judged by the seriousness of the effects, their potential to cause fatality or irreversible damage, the drug's therapeutic benefits, and the types of patients suffering the adverse effects. Thus, for a drug that's used in healthy individuals, even a small risk of serious adverse effects would be unacceptable, and then some examples are given. So is this right that, in a similar way to your description of the risk-benefit analysis undertaken during the product licensing stage, when the licensing authority or CSM were considering the adverse reaction reports, there would then again be an analysis of risk and benefit, looking at how serious the adverse effect was. Sir Michael?
Yes, that's correct.
And so a judgment would need to be made, for example, if it was a report of hepatitis or jaundice, an assessment would need to be made by the medical staff within the medicines division of how of the seriousness of, for example, non-A, non-B hepatitis and its potential for long-term liver damage?
Yes, yes, and of course, any jaundice is a serious problem. I mean, it indicates liver damage, and so it would be considered serious.
And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 23. Paragraph 23 says, once a possible adverse reaction problem with a particular drug has been identified, a medical officer would be given the responsibility for its full investigation by examining the original reports received on the suspect drug and conducting a comprehensive analysis of these in order to characterise the reaction and identify possible risk factors. In the process of this assessment, the medical officer would exclude duplicate reports and those where there's not good evidence of an association between the drug and reaction. The final analysis would therefore only take into account those reports where there's evidence to suggest that the reaction was possibly or probably associated with the suspect drug. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, paragraph 25 explains that the medical officer would also examine information from sources other than the yellow cards, such as medical literature, etc. So what this is describing is a process of in Professor Asher's words, full investigation of the adverse reaction reports. Is that your recollection as to what happened, Sir Michael?
I think so, yes.
And then if we go over the page, please, to page 14, paragraph 27, it says all of this information would be used as a basis for a risk-benefit assessment of the drug under investigation. Then there's reference to the particular drug that was the subject of this set of legal proceedings. And then the last sentence there, it says, a report of the findings would be presented to the subcommittees of the committee for their views. Their recommendations would then be passed to the committee for consideration. And then the next paragraph, paragraph 28, then explains that the committee would advise the licensing authority of its conclusions, make recommendations on what action would be required, and it explains that the committee could decide on recommend revocation or suspension of the product's licence or the need to provide warnings or variation of the drug's product licence. So, is it right to understand that other than for those adverse reaction reports which the senior medical officer has decided on assessment and where has decided that there's no link between the drug and the adverse reaction, all others where there's a possible or probable link should be fully investigated, a risk-benefit analysis undertaken, and that would then be presented to the subcommittee on which you sat and then to the Committee on the Safety of Medicines? Is that the process?
Yes.
And so, can you recall whether, through that yellow card scheme and the adverse reports process, the links between hepatitis and factor concentrates came to the consideration of the SEER, of the subcommittee? Sir Michael?
I'm trying to think. Yes, I think that'd be about right. Yes.
Yes, we'll take a short break. Can you recall, Sir Michael, if your subcommittee ever saw a risk-benefit analysis, so I'm talking about the adverse reaction subcommittee here, in relation to factor concentrates and hepatitis or factor concentrates and AIDS?
Not that I can recall, no.
There's then, I think, one further document I wanted to ask you about on this topic of adverse reactions. Again, it's exhibited to your statement, Sir Michael. It's at WITN 6406025. Now, this is if we just look at the top line to start with, please, Paul. A table, it says all UK spontaneous suspected adverse drug reaction ADR reports received by the MHRA between 1970 and it's December 1995, we'll see in a minute over the page. And we can see the years there, 1970 through to, if we just go further down the table, Paul, 1995. And if we go over the page, we can see there we've got the total number of adverse drug reaction reports in the left-hand column, so something in the region of 310,000 reports in that period. The total number of ADR reports in relation to blood products is identified at the bottom of the page there as 144. And then
Yes.
the right-hand column, total number of ADR reports of blood products relating to HIV and AIDS, the total number there given is 79. Now,
Yes.
can you help us with this, please, Sir Michael? If we look, for example, at the fifth line down, we've got the entry of 3 reports relating to HIV or AIDS. But
Yes.
that's for 1970, I think 4 or 5. And then there are other reports which appear to correlate with dates in the 1970s, i.e. before HIV or AIDS was ever on the scene. Are you able to explain, do you know how this table was put together?
No, I don't. I don't know, and I very much think there's an error because, as you already indicated, it wasn't until the early 1980s that AIDS was actually first described. So I think there's an error here.
In any event, would it be right to understand from this, if we just look at the total numbers, the number of ADR reports in relation to blood products is pretty small, considering the numbers who we know were infected with HIV or with non-A, non-B hepatitis, hepatitis C, which would suggest substantial under-reporting of adverse reactions associated with blood products. Is that fair?
Yes, well, I'm rather suspicious about the reliability of this data.
Well,
Because the 3 reports from the 1970s of AIDS just couldn't have happened.
well, it may be we need to go back to the MHRA in relation to that and ask for more data. So that's...
Yes, I think those who are watching remotely might need just to have you deal with the dates. In particular, if we look at the right-hand column that we're looking at now, of the total number of ADR reports of blood products relating to HIV/AIDS, if we come down to 10 and then 19, is that 1978, 79?
Yes, I think so.
So there were 6 reports before 78, and so on back up to where we started. And when we get to 1984, 1983, 1984, there are something like 3 and 0.
Yes.
So this indicates there is something on the face of it which needs explanation, because this data doesn't appear on the face of it can't appear to relate to HIV/AIDS, and it's most surprising that there wasn't a report in 83, 84.
Yes, quite.
Or not, no, only 3 reports.
But I don't think Sir Michael can probably help us with that.
I don't think he can. It's not for him. He didn't produce this table.
No.
It was produced by others. Yes, we'll take a break.
Yes.
You're finished. This line.
Yes, there's a couple more questions, but they require some other documents which we can...
Okay. Well, we'll take a break for 10 minutes and then come back and have a further session before lunch.
Thank you, sir.
So just a quick 10-minute break. Give you a break, Professor, and until 22:01.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, Michael, I'm going to ask you next about some evidence you gave to a working party of the Royal College of Physicians about the relationships between physicians and pharmaceutical companies and certain ethical concerns that you held.
Yes, I just can't remember this working party at all, but...
Don't worry. What I'll do is I'm going to put the documents up on screen briefly so that others can see them, and then just take you to one thing that you said. So just for the benefit of others, RCPH 0000299 and we can see there it's headed Royal College of Physicians, a meeting of the College Working Party on the ethics of the relationship between physicians and the pharmaceutical industry. And this is from October 1984. Now, you provided, if we keep that up on screen for the moment, please, Paul, you provided a written statement to the Working Party. I'm not going to put it up or go through it, but I'm just going to read the reference aloud so others can see it, which is RCPH 0000310. And then the Working Party's ultimate report, again, Paul, we don't need to put this up, is RCPH 0000105. I just want to look at something you said orally during this Working Party meeting and then ask you about that. So if we go to page 6, please. And it's the bottom half of the page, beginning with 6A. Talks about the president then welcomed Dr. Rawlins.
I clearly wasn't that. That's why I don't remember it very well, because I wasn't actually a member of the Working Party. They just invited me along to give some evidence to them. That was all.
That's absolutely right. And you talk there about a fundamental ethical issue based on the fact that doctors spend very large sums of public money each year, that the public could reasonably expect doctors to prescribe drugs with reference to their efficacy, safety and economy. The public might sometimes feel the prescriptions were based on drug company advertising and there was much public concern. And then I just wanted to ask you, first of all, about something you said. It's the bottom of that paragraph where it's reported, Dr. Rawlins said it was evident on occasions that pressure was used by colleagues who'd been doing research on behalf of a company, and he felt strongly that consultancies and their financial details should be declared. Were those colleagues on the Committee on the Safety of Medicine or its subcommittee that you were referring to there, or colleagues in Newcastle, or can you not remember?
Colleagues generally.
Okay. And you go on to express, bottom of the page, concerns about hospitality. You'd like to see hospitality totally divorced from promotion.
Yes.
And then top of the next page, I won't read through the detail of it, but you were concerned about the sponsorship that would be provided by pharmaceutical companies for doctors to attend conferences and so on abroad and things like that. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And then if we just look at one further document on this issue, it's JEVA 0000125. This is a newspaper article, but it reports you, Professor Rawlins, I'm afraid we don't have the date, as saying this. There is a certain amount of covert bribery. One drug company recently flew a lot of consultants to Spain to hear about their drugs. They invited me to go. If they were introducing their drugs to people in Newcastle, they wouldn't get such a good turnout, whereas going to Spain could whet appetites. When you talk to doctors, they always say, I go along and I have their drink and I'm not influenced by it, but subconsciously they must be. The companies are not idiots. They would not do it if it was not worthwhile. And then it says he agreed that there was a legitimate area in which drug companies had the responsibility to inform doctors about new products, but Professor Rawlins declared education gets mixed up with financial rewards or other substitutes. So it sounds as though this was a real problem that you were concerned about at this time, Professor Rawlins. Is that right?
Yes, I don't know where I've seen that, and I don't know where it came from. But anyway,
And what you...
it's certainly my view then, and it would be now.
And what you wanted and what you were saying to the Royal College of Physicians Working Party is you wanted there to be much greater transparency about any relationships between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. And you wanted to end any practices of pharmaceutical companies providing excessive hospitality or sponsoring doctors to go overseas and so on. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Do you recall whether you had any particular knowledge of or concerns about, in that regard, Dr. Peter Jones, the director of the Newcastle Haemophilia Reference Centre, and his relationships with pharmaceutical companies?
I have no idea. No.
If I can then just ask you a couple more general questions next, Sir Michael. Did the CSM or its subcommittees have any regular interactions with anyone in the Department of Health apart from the Medicines Division?
No. No, it was the Medicines Division, and then they communicated to the licensing authority. We didn't have any direct interaction with with ministers, except on one or two occasions. On one occasion, one Secretary of State wanted me to write a Dear Doctor letter. It was just before I was actually chairman. I was vice chair, and he wanted me to write a Dear Doctor letter to say a product was safe, and I declined because I was standing in for Bill Asher, Sir William Asher, and my sending out while he was on holiday or something, and sending out a Dear Doctor letter wouldn't have gone down very well. But to send out a Dear Doctor letter to say something is safe, I refused. This is when William Waldegrave was Secretary of State.
Do you recall whether the CSM or its subcommittees had any particular interactions or dealings with the CDSC, the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre?
Not that I recall.
And then, in terms of patient involvement, did the CSM or its subcommittees, or indeed, to your knowledge, the Medicines Division, ever have much interaction with patients or with patient representative groups?
No, I don't think they did. Nowadays, the MHRA does, but in those days, no.
Now, I want to ask you next a few questions specifically about the scrutiny of blood products by the CSM. I'm conscious that that would have been the responsibility of the Biologicals Subcommittee, which was not the committee upon which you sat. But I wanted to see if I can explore a range of issues with you. First of all, can you recall anything about your own understanding of the risks of hepatitis transmission and the seriousness of hepatitis back in the 1980s?
Not that I recall.
Okay. And do you recall how and when you started to learn about AIDS and the possible connection between AIDS and blood products?
Yes, well, AIDS was first described in 1981 or something like that in America, and then, of course, 2 or 3 years later, it was discovered to be due to a virus, the human immunogenicity virus, HIV, and it was around about that time that we started worrying about it at the CSM.
Now, I'm going to ask you to look at a couple of passages in your witness statement, WITN 6406001, and if we go to page 26, I think it is. So it's paragraph 7.5 and 7.6.
Yep.
You say there, even before I joined the CSM, it would consider the source of donated blood used in blood products. Our interest and scrutiny of this issue grew as the terrible situation of infected blood emerged. I cannot now remember the details of what changed and when. And then in paragraph 7.6, you refer to a grant of a licence for COATE, February 76, so before you joined the CSM, which was subject to a condition that satisfactory information be provided about the number of donations in each pool. So the two issues you've identified there, Sir Michael, the source of the blood and the pool sizes. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the detail of product licence applications before you joined the CSM. But do you have any recollection of any discussion at the CSM itself of either the source of blood donations for factor concentrates, whether it was collected from prisons and the like, or from high-risk areas in the United States and elsewhere, or any discussion about pool sizes and their significance?
No.
In
No,
principle,
sorry.
is it right to understand that the power to impose conditions on a licence was a very wide power?
Yes, yes.
So there are all sorts of conditions that could be imposed. You could require a manufacturer to provide information about pool sizes, or you could require a manufacturer only to use pool sizes of a certain magnitude. In principle, is that correct?
Well, in principle, it would have been possible, yes.
From time to time in the documents, there are references to conditions or the provision of information about the sources of blood and a requirement that satisfactory information be provided to the licensing authority about the sources of blood. Do you know whose role it would have been within the licensing authority or the CSM and its subcommittees to assess whether the information being provided about the sources of blood was satisfactory or not?
No, no. And we now know in retrospect that they were unsatisfactory.
Yes. Yes. I should say, Sir Michael, there's obviously...
Can I just say one other thing? I happened to read something that David Owen, Lord Owen, wrote, I think in a written statement to you, about the fact that when he was Minister of Health in the mid-1970s, he tried to persuade the department for the UK to be self-sufficient in blood products. I never knew that. I did know David Owen a bit because he was at Thomas's same time as I was. Well, he was a year or two older, but I was fascinated by the fact that he wanted to be self-sufficient. This was in the mid-1970s.
Absolutely. I should say, Sir Michael, I think a few moments ago you talked about how I've lost the reference on the transcript now, about knowing in retrospect that issues about sources of blood and pool sizes were unsatisfactory. I'm just going to, for the benefit of those listening, identify that obviously a question for the inquiry is whether that was known or should have been known at the time, not just in retrospect. But I'm not going to ask you about that, Sir Michael, because you were not involved in the grant of the product licences in the 1970s.
No.
Just looking at the kinds of conditions as a matter of generality that might be imposed. Would it be right to understand that licence conditions could include the licensing authority specifying the contents of the warnings that should be included on, for example, product labels or in leaflets?
Oh, yes, yes. We could have insisted on those, yes.
And could there be a condition about monitoring the therapeutic efficacy and safety of a product and reporting those results to the licensing authority?
Well, they would have, yes. I mean, it applies to all medicines, and they would report them to the medicines division.
Can I ask you to look at one document before two documents just before we break for lunch. The first is at MHRA 0036365_001. Do you need that number again, Paul? Oh, thank you. So you'll see, Sir Michael, this is a meeting, if we just zoom in at the top of the page, of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, 22nd of January 1981, and you are listed as one of the attendees.
Yes.
If we go to page 3, paragraph 8, it says there, the committee held 2 hearings in respect of, and the second hearing was Humanate, Spaywood Laboratories. I just draw your attention to that because we're going to look at the record of the committee's findings of that in a moment. But before we do that, if we go to page 4, and the bottom half of the page, any other business, it's paragraph 13.2, so it's the bottom of the page. Mr. Williams informed members that the division was shortly to hold a weekend retreat to discuss the problems associated with the implementation of the Medicines Act. The chairman of Section 4 committees and their subcommittees had been invited to attend, and it was hoped that the occasion would provide an opportunity to give serious consideration to long-term problems in administering the licensing system established by the Medicines Act. Do you have any recollection, Sir Michael, either from this document or more generally from your years on the CSM, of what those problems were thought to be in terms of administering the licensing system?
No.
Well, don't worry, we may be able to trace it through other documents in that case.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry.
No. And then the last document before we break for lunch is just the note of the hearing regarding Spaywood Laboratories and Humanate. If we go, please, to MHRA 0036365_018. Now, this is a summary of the hearing that was referred to in the minutes. So, Michael, I'm not going to ask you about the detail of the committee's deliberations. It was about whether Spaywood Laboratories should be able to continue to use and supply a product called Humanate, which was a factor concentrate. All I want to ask you about is if we pick up at the bottom of page 3, under the heading Hearing, it says the representatives of the company were as follows: Mr. Williams, who we know worked for Spaywood, and then Dr. P.M. Jones, that's Dr. Peter Jones, Director of the Haemophilia Centre in Newcastle. And if we go over the page, and we pick it up at paragraph 4.4, that's about halfway down the page. It says at 4.4, Dr. Jones then explained he'd come to the hearing as an independent consultant, unpaid. to advise the committee that in his capacity as director of a haemophilia centre, he'd satisfactorily treated patients with Humanate. Was it common for treating clinicians to appear before the CSM or its subcommittees to advocate on behalf of a commercial company?
It did happen. I can't tell you how often it happened. It did happen, yes. Yes.
And do you have any views on the appropriateness of that?
Well, he did say that he wasn't being paid to appear, so that's at least something. And sometimes, a company wants to have an expert to explain its product. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable. I think it just has to be done with care. And of course, members of the committee would also need to take into account the potential conflict of interest.
So I note the time, and I'm going to move to a different issue next. So perhaps we could take our lunch break now.
Yes, well, we'll take a slightly shorter lunch break than usual. We'll come back at 10 to 2.
So back at 10 to 2, Sir Michael.
10 to 2, Sir Michael.
Right, I've got it. 10 to 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.